Sup, Kimosabi? I'm Leon the Paperback Maniac, coming at you with another vintage horror book review. Today, we are taking a look at Orgy of the Blood Parasites by Kim Newman, writing under the pen name Jack Yeovil. Now, this book was published by Pocket Books in 1994. I'll begin by reading the synopsis from the back cover. Why has a peaceful university campus turned into a hell of mutating flesh, bizarre sexual permutations, and horrifying random violence? When a raid on a secret research laboratory frees a group of animals, an infection is passed on to many of the students and staff of a red brick university. Some of those stricken die messily, but many others change, coming to a grotesque accommodation with their disease. Caught between friends who have become monsters and a ruthless security squad, lecturer Brian Connors and student Monica Finch must fight to stay alive and warn the outside world of the horrors that are being born. But in the infected brain tissue of a dead scientist, a virus is learning how to think, preparing to fight its own battle for survival. Now, if that synopsis doesn't make you want to pause this video immediately, make a mad dash over to Amazon or A-Books or eBay or wherever you get your books and pick this thing up right away, I don't know what I can do for you. I can't help you. So, as I mentioned, this book is written by Kim Newman. He is a very reputable horror author and critic. Even the title of this book is sort of an Easter egg of sorts that only the nerdiest horror motherfuckers among us would get. Orgy of the Blood Parasites was actually the shooting title for the David Cronenberg SF horror flick Shivers, also known as They Came From Within. There it is. There is even an epigraph from David Cronenberg at the beginning of this book, which I will read to you now because it is important. So a little quote from David Cronenberg. Perhaps some diseases, perceived as diseases, which destroy a well-functioning machine, in fact change the machine into a machine that does something else. And we have to figure out what it is that the machine now does. Instead of having a defective machine, we have a nicely functioning machine that just has a different purpose. Part of it is a self-deceptive way of coping with the possibilities of disease, but on the other hand, I can imagine what it feels like to be a virus. The AIDS virus. Look at it from his point of view. Very vital, very excited, really having a good time. It's made the front page and is really flexing its muscles and doing what it does. It's really a triumph if you're a virus. It's really good stuff that's happening. It's not bad at all. So I thought that was pretty interesting, especially in view of sort of like the current circumstances, right, in this age of the virus. Leave it to David Cronenberg to have empathy with a virus, right? Just see it from its point of view. It's just trying to survive, right? So, so in this book, we get some very, very passionate student activists who break into the chem building on campus to release some rabbits that are being experimented on. Rabbits that, unbeknownst to them, have been injected with a virulent virus and have essentially mutated. And now, a number of these activists get bitten in the process, and basically a bunch of shit that just goes down immediately. One of the guys, the ringleader of the group, this total sociopath who's basically a terrorist, even brains a security guard in the process. One of the rabbits that looks like roadkill ends up escaping into town and ends up biting our professor protagonist's 8-year-old boy through his bedroom window. And shit is just goes totally awry. And before you know it, it is total mayhem on campus. Now, the first symptoms that the infected exhibit is a wild, almost feral sexual drive. And coupled with that is superhuman strength and hyperacute senses and kind of like this undeniable compulsion to harm. Not only to harm, but to rend flesh and even to eat it. We get some nasty scenes of unrelenting brutality here. Guys try to rape women and then get their balls crushed and their dicks fed to them in turn. One girl in particular is totally empowered once she becomes infected with the virus. And, she just has never felt more alive. She kills anyone in her way and uses anyone to fulfill her insatiable sexual appetite. She basically is having orgasms like nonstop and is just constantly filled with urges, to screw and destroy. The virus does do some pretty nasty work. I'll read a quote to show what happens to a nurse who's been exposed. Let's see. Nurse Preston's cheeks inflated like a football, and his forehead bulged. White stretches of scalp showed in his hair. The neck expanded, and rips grew under the now tiny-seeming ears. Panicked eyes shrank in gaping sockets. Seams appeared in his skin and parted, showing red and muscle. The flesh swelled around his nose, making the protuberance an indentation. Then Preston's head exploded. So, you can definitely see the Cronenberg imagery there, right? And then, the afflicted soon just start releasing their ids out of the attic, just kind of releasing all of their pent-up rage and frustration. In a particularly funny scene, one of the college students who goes to drop off his final exam runs across this pretentious blowhard classmate that he despises, who kind of sees him and smugly offers for him to take a look at his final. And what the dude does is he takes the final, he rolls it up into a scroll, and then just rams it down this hoity motherfucker's throat, causing him to collapse on the ground, foaming at the mouth. And then the dude whips out his dick and pisses on his face. It's just it's brutal. We get, like I said, other people who are infected start acting out. This little boy, tries to rape his babysitter and then ends up getting hacked up in the process with a carving knife. It is pretty cool because we do get sort of the POV of these infected as they are experiencing these changes, as they're kind of mutating, or in their from their point of view, evolving into sort of a higher state of being. They feel like they're becoming this new, better and improved humanity 2.0, right? And all the while, their skin is sagging and sloughing off, and their bodies are completely being rearranged into this exciting, new forms of biology. It's really cool. And soon, these infected people, or evolved people, however you want to look at it, start amassing disciples, and their numbers start growing, right? And then they decide that they want to kind of breed babies of their own and replace the current humanity, right? So that they can be the first sort of non-human generation. But to do that, of course, they're going to have to wipe out the previous humanity to have a fresh start. And, I really enjoyed sort of the myriad descriptions of what happens to these hapless people who contract the virus. Like I said, their skin starts to slough off so that you can see muscles sliding off of bone, body parts just keep breaking away and coming undone. It's really, really fun stuff. And of course, ultimately, as this tagline tells us, a scientist who has been infected in the laboratory, his brain starts to develop sentience, or as it's stated in the book, the brain goes from sentience to sapience. In other words, it gets wise. And then, before you know it, the brain starts to grow and expand, and it starts to sprout these nerve tangles that thicken, and then they grow these barbs at their tips, which can sink into the cadavers in the laboratory and reanimate the bodies, which then kind of merge together in this Frankenstein Frankenstein-like super body that houses the brain, like fucking Krang from Ninja Turtles. And because the brain also is like so highly evolved that it can sort of shape its environment, it also like uses the available like equipment and like hardware and steel and fuses it all together to form like this protective shield around it, so that it is like kind of like it ends up just being this amalgam of like different body parts and different like surfaces to create this amazing sort of like structure to it. Very, very Cronenbergian. And, it wants to protect itself. And can you blame it, right? I mean, like, as Cronenberg said, just look at it from the virus's point of view. Just like anything that is sentient and is alive, what is the key goal? It wants to stay alive. It wants to protect itself, self-defense, right? And preserving itself. You kind of almost, in a way, relate to this virus, right? And anyway, like at a certain point when the virus starts talking, it even refers to a dude as Kimosabi. So, I mean, come on, like I gotta kind of like, connect to this thing, right? It can't be all that bad. Here's another quote sort of detailing the virus's development, which I will read to you guys. Let's see, where is this thing? 125, that's the name of the virus, detached itself completely from the ceiling, leaving an afterbirth of dead tissue hanging like mold from the fluorescent light panel, and gathered itself in. It had no aesthetics, no morality, no philosophy, no cultural background, and just a smidgen of a sense of humor. But it could learn. It was confident of its ability to get on in the world. So I just think that's really cool. And this thing is so cool. It even shoots out like a spike of fused bone that can tunnel into the foreheads of people and sort of act as a kind of vacuum tube to like slurp up all of the people's brain matter, so that it can like learn from the people, right? And at one point, it even quips by saying, "I've got the looks, you've got the brains," as it's like vacuuming out their brain tissue to add to it. So it's constantly adding to itself, both physically and mentally, just like subsuming everything into its quote unquote viral identity. And, as I mentioned before, it is pretty fascinating how the people, meanwhile, who are infected with the virus are sort of like forming this kind of new world order, right? They're this kind of humanity 2.0 with constantly mutating bodies, with people sprouting lobster-like claws and spikes and chain-like appendages through the skin.
Long live the new flesh!
Mic drop indeed, right? You're welcome for that, by the way. But yeah, it's like some straight up Nightbreed shit. I mean, by the end, and by the way, Nightbreed, there's another Cronenberg connection, right? People by the end who are infected have lost any semblance of humanity and have, quote, faces like starfish, scales and plumage, talons and pincers, huge eyes and mouths. And it is pretty fascinating how Newman, even ironically, manages to infuse a little bit of humanity into the virus, which I guess if you think about it, because the virus is sort of an amalgamation of everyone that it is subsumed, I guess it's not too ironic, but I mean, like in just a single line at the very end of this book, the author manages to make me have empathy for this virus. Not only empathy, but, even feel kind of sorry for the virus at the end. And, today in this age, in April of 2020, to make me have sympathy for a virus, that is a fucking feat, right? But the writing itself is very solid, very British, I must say. Newman is a British author. Often I can read, British horror novels and kind of forget that they take place in England or that they're British, but not so here. I was constantly coming across words and phrases that were foreign to me, and so that was pretty interesting for me. But yeah, it has a great sense of humor as well. I definitely found myself chuckling. One kind of interesting thing in this book is that, throughout the novel, Newman seems to cheekily kind of poke fun at sort of like the militant, sanctimonious student protest groups that are, out there. And it kind of not unlike what Eli Roth did years later in The Green Inferno, but, kind of highlighting this sort of naive hypocrisy and sort of like the shallowness of some of these like student SJW groups, and how they're sometimes just like a little bit out of their depth and not really like in it maybe like for the right reasons. I think it's pretty well summed up with this choice bit of description characterizing an extreme activist who is the one actually to arrange to liberate, quote unquote, these bunnies. It says, quote, "For a man who spent his life crusading against cruelty, he struck her as a bit of a sadist. He might not hurt a mouse, but he would have no difficulty garroting a fellow human being." Very Carol Baskin-esque, right? So it's kind of like beneath the facade of a righteous conviction, there's definitely like a darkness there that's not so warm and fuzzy and caring, right? But yeah, I also kind of found it amusing how Newman also pokes a little fun at PC culture in this book, which I thought was very ahead of its time and prescient, looking ahead to now where we have like the woke police on Twitter who get all up in arms about it, like the smallest, littlest thing. Like at one point, a character arrives on campus and finds that the front desk is empty. And like isn't being manned, and then she immediately corrects herself and says, "Oh no, personed, not manned. We can't say manned, right?" And it's kind of like, I just thought that was really amusing, like the war on semantics, right? I thought that was very, very prescient indeed. We also have like a funny episode with like this radio DJ who's like constantly holding the torch for like classic rock artists, like like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly, but he's like called an imperial racist by his fellow DJs who insist on having sort of like every day of the week like spotlighting a different like country in terms of like playing rock music. And at one point he like jokes, "Oh, well, when are we going to get to Antarctica?" And then like the DJs are like, "Oh, who's from Antarctica? Like we should look into that." And then he just kind of like sighs and slumps against the wall and imagines that he is a masked killer in a quote unquote slice and dice movie, and he's just like going at these pretentious blowhards. I thought that was really funny. But yeah, this is a very, very enjoyable book. I guess if I had to say some negatives, I wasn't as interested in the scenes involving the sort of security squad that is dispatched to try to put these infected people down. I found that those parts kind of like cold, and I wasn't as invested in it. And that's actually the problem I have with a lot of zombie fiction, whether it's books or movies. I like it when it deals with like the characters who are going through this, but once we get into like the military and the government and how they're trying to suppress it and all of the stratagems that are involved in like these high-tech sort of maneuvers to put down the virus, I just kind of check out a little bit, so I didn't care so much. But when it's detailing with the students and like the professor and their travails, then I'm like totally on board and invested. But yeah, overall, I greatly enjoyed this book. I'm very happy that I own it. I'm very happy that I read it. I'm very happy that I read it now, in 2020, because, in a way, this is sort of like the novel for the current era, right? Because it's all about adaptation. We've all had to adapt over the last few weeks, right? I mean, to various degrees, but it's kind of interesting. And I just have to say, before you feel the urge to sort of bitch about whatever your situation is, being quarantined, before you kvetch about social distancing or, like not being able to invite your friends over, just know that it could be much worse, right? At least your backbone isn't jellifying and you don't have to, quote, squirm, crawl, squiggle, and slime your way to the refrigerator, right? Could be worse, right? So, yeah, I mean, if you like sort of like weird, heady, philosophical horror that's not afraid to go for the gross out often, I may say. If you are a fan of the Del Abyss line of quote-unquote cutting-edge horror, even though this was not a Del Abyss book, it easily could have been. I'm surprised it wasn't. If you're one of the 5 people out there who enjoys the 1988 campus virus film Primal Rage, and of course, if you're a fan of David Cronenberg's works, then this is definitely the book for you. So check it out. Definitely does get an endorsement from me. So that's it, guys. Hope you enjoyed that review. Thanks for watching. Check back soon for more vintage horror book reviews and maybe a haul or two in the near future. Hope you guys are doing well, staying safe. I'll see you next time. Peace out.